Good evening, everyone. Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on what part of the world you're in. Folks who are online, folks who are here in person. This is the Tuesday tune in. So that means, as usual, we're going to begin with a guided meditation and move from that about half an hour or so, and move from that into Dharma talk, Dharma reflection for some time, leaving enough time at the end for questions and comments. And you may have noticed that it says that we are live on YouTube, but that's a little bit of a misnomer. That's just the way that the talks are recorded. So it is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube. But I always turn off the recording at the question and answer time so that you can really feel comfortable saying or asking what you need to share. And if you ever have any concern about other parts of the recording, then please don't hesitate to let me know. So we will go ahead and get started with our meditation. And this evening, we're just going to do a very simple mindfulness of breathing. And sometimes folks can experience some tightness around the breath or some feeling of wanting to control it or uh, uneasiness. And if that starts to happen, then I recommend that you follow the breath in the lower abdomen. So there's not actual breath there, but there's the echo of the breath in terms of movement. And for now, just beginning, perhaps rocking the body, moving the head. Loosening up any tendency to be leaning toward the computer. And sensing the weight of the body on the seat. Feeling into the natural stability of the body sitting. Allowing the spine to come into alignment and bring you into an upright posture. Softening the eyes. Softening the chest. Making room for this open-hearted practice. And then finding a place where it's easy to rest the mind on the sensation of the breath. Could be in the nostrils or the throat, in the chest or in the diaphragm, or all the way down to the lower abdomen. Aware of thoughts in the background and the breath in the foreground. And particularly observing the pauses between the breaths. No need to change them at all. Just resting in those moments of quiet. Staying curious about the breath of this moment. And having found those pauses between the breaths, also present for those moments of beginning, the start of each inhalation and each exhalation. And by observing those moments of beginning, start of each inhalation and exhalation, you can also rest the mind on the length of the breath. Just observing those periods of movement until the next pause, next period of stillness. Returning again and again to the sensations of the breath. And in these last few moments of the meditation, opening the attention to the whole body. Resting the attention on the whole body in the sitting posture. Still aware of the breath breathing the body. Beautiful. So that is our meditation practice for this evening. And if you have any questions about that, we can take those at the end. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and transition directly into the Dhamma talk. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. The Dhamma is said to be like a raft. Some of you may be familiar with this metaphor from the early Buddhist teachings, the early texts called the Nikayas. Said to be a raft to take us from one shore to the other shore. So the image is of a river or a flooded crossing. And this raft, I would suggest, is not carrying us over the rough waters, the floods, to the other side, to a place of steadiness. It is actually a place of steadiness in the midst of those rough waters, those floods. Mm. And once you get to the other side, to that bank on the other side of the rough waters, then you leave the raft behind. You leave it behind, specifically for others to use. And so this we start at a place of steadiness because we're on one bank, but it's a place that feels unsafe. In fact, the way that the story in the sutta is told is that there are some people chasing you, some people who might want to do you harm or who you're running away from. And you get to this place where you can't cross because the waters are too rough and too high. And so you quickly make a raft and go across to the other side. And so I would suggest that that when we get to that other side, we see that actually there was some steadiness in the first place. There was some possibility for peace in the first place, but we didn't really know how. We didn't know what to do. For this reason, you often see later on in the Mahayana teachings the teaching that this shore and the other shore are the same. But I think that most of us have experienced that there are some rough waters, and that we benefit from having the help of the raft of Dhamma to steady us in the midst of rough waters of life. Of that you can be sure. No one escapes rough waters of some sort or another. But as I said, I think that the important way of relating to the Dhamma as a raft is to understand that that is our place of steadiness right there when we're in the rough waters. Not in some place of escape. And for this reason, I often like to place the emphasis on the Dhamma as a path of peace and not a path to peace. But as I said, I think also there is this time of not knowing how to be with the rough waters of one's life, how to be standing on whichever shore you happen to be on, how to use The Dhamma as a raft can be this many points of not knowing, or perhaps not even wanting to. I think this is one of the doubts that I often hear. People think about, do I really want peace? Isn't passion much better? Do I really want to set aside dreaming and be right here with the raft and the rough waters and the shores? And for sure, I can relate to the question. I grew up in a Latin family. My father is from Bogota, Colombia. And there was a lot of passion going on in my early childhood life. Some of you know that I often tell the joke that my household growing up was like I Love Lucy. I thought everybody's household was like I Love Lucy because that's what my house was like. It wasn't until I started visiting my friends that I thought, well, wait, their house isn't like my house. What is it? And so some of you may know there is a very strong value for passion in Latin culture, for very strong expression. And I learned over time what that could mean, how that could be both beneficial and harmful, and actually neutral too. Strong expression isn't a problem. But the question before us is still what can we do with this life in which we are swept away by the rough waters? And so for that, I brought a poem. And it's a poem by a Thai master named Ajahn Mun. And this is a translation of the poem by Ajahn Mun. And Ajahn Mun's not very well known teacher. He lived from 1870 to 1949, so quite a while ago now, about 100 years ago now, was his time of teaching and practicing in Thailand. And this poem, but he was quite highly respected. According to Ajahn Thanissaro, one of the most highly respected Buddhist monk in recent Thai history. So however, there were very few recordings of him or any kinds of writings from him, very few writings. But after he died, this poem was found among his personal objects, his personal things. And it's a very interesting poem. It's a quite long poem, actually, so I'm not going to tell the whole thing. But basically, what he does is that he begins by paying homage to the Buddha, and then he goes through this imaginary conversation with a sage in which he is questioning a sage. And so we don't know which sage it is, but I interpret this to be Ajahn Mun's way of working out his own doubts, working out his own questions about practice. It's one way to think about what this represented for him and why it would be among his personal effects. And so he begins the poem with some statements, and I'm going to skip over part of this about this one about the body right now. We can come back to that if folks really want to, but right now I'm going to skip over to the next part, which is where he is describing, the sage is describing an experience, a meditative experience. So the first question that he asks the sage is, what runs? What runs? And what the sage responds, what runs quickly is vijnana. Vijnana is a Pali word, usually often translated as consciousness. Here, Ajahn Thanissaro decided to translate it as heart. That's also one way of thinking about it. Heart, mind, the whole. Although I typically think of consciousness, vijnana, as being a part of the mind and not the whole of the mind. But Thanissaro is taking this tack, so let's see where it goes. What runs quickly is vijnana, the heart, movements walking in a row, one after the other. And so this is very important to just stop right there and say, what exactly, what does that mean? How to relate to that? So if you think about, there are two different ways that consciousness is described, in at least two different ways, probably more, but two different ways that we need to discern about how consciousness is described, or vijnana is described in early Buddhism. And you can think of it as, it's being described as momentary arisings, and it's also being described as a kind of flow or a sequence. So I think of this as not being contradictory, right? So for example, in physics now, we know that light is both individual particles and it is a wave. So if you ask a physicist, is light a particle or is it a wave? That person would probably say, yes. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, if somebody asks, if you think about consciousness, is it a moment, a momentary arising at one of the six sense doors? Yes. And does it have some continuity as well? Yes. Both things would be true, are true. So this way of looking at the consciousness as moments walking in a row, one after the other. But what is it that's happening? That's not doubting that sanya's perceptions are right. The heart gets caught up in the running back and forth. So there's a question here about perception and how do we relate to our perceptions about the world and about ourselves. So perceptions, it says, grab hold of things outside and pull them in to fool the mind. Yeah, so some of you have heard me say before that sometimes I think about the mind as being like an octopus with all these long arms and the very sticky little arms, and the consciousness will attach itself to something and pull that thing in. And so that is a way in which, that's one direction in which we are taking our perception of an object and experiencing it in a way that we believe we have captured it. We have the thing within our concept, within our mind. the opposite is also true, that there is a tendency of the mind to impute, to then project out whatever thing, perception we have about a thing, and assume that that is actually the characteristic of the thing. Both things are true. But to keep going, the perception fools the heart with various objects like a mirage. So that's one of the very fundamental metaphors that the Buddha gave for perception. That perception is like a mirage. All perception is like a mirage. So we tend to see something that we tend to believe that we are seeing something that is on top of the actual phenomena that are present. That's what we mean by seeing it as a mirage, right? Like a shimmer on a hot road. There isn't water actually there. But then he goes on and he says, so he asks the next question, well, what is it that gains release from the five khandhas? And that's the title of this poem, is Liberation, the Ballad of Liberation from the five khandhas, from body and mind. And it's the heart, of course, the heart alone, that doesn't get entangled anymore. And so he goes on, he says some other statements, and then he says this: the heart ferrets it out, the truth ferrets out this way of freedom. It tries to, it understands how perception says good and grasps at bad and forces the heart to fasten on loving and hating. So what the Ajahn is pointing to there is that freedom is found in our ability to observe this process, right, of loving and hating, of grasping at things, of internalizing things, of fastening on to, grasping onto, craving objects, clinging onto objects. But then he asks the key question, right, which is related to this question of doubt or why. Why go there? He says, to eat once and never look for more, meaning, okay, so if I were completely free from good and bad, if I were completely free from any wanting, if I were completely released from the heart, clinging to any object whatsoever, then would I just starve to death? Because then I wouldn't even bother to like go have a meal or go to the bathroom, or I mean, you become just like a stone? That's the question. And so the answer is the end of wanting to look, to know, to hope for knowing more, the end of entanglements. So let me read that again. The end of wanting to look, wanting to know, the end of hope for knowing more, the end of entanglements. The mind, so now he's switched from heart to mind here. The mind sits still on its dais, on its platform, discarding its attachments. So what would that look like? The end of hope for knowing more. I would propose that what that looks like is complete satisfaction with what is present right now, with what is known. Not imputing on it some other thing, not adding on to it something which builds up one sense of self, or something which is not self. The end of wanting to know more. So you wouldn't stop eating. That's the answer. The answer is it's not about stopping eating, right? Because if what's known is hunger, then there is an appropriate response to that. But there isn't some kind of extra on top of it. And that is the question. That is, for us, a pointer, a good pointer. The end of wanting to know, the end of the hope for knowing more. So I propose complete satisfaction with the knowing of now. And then he says, okay, so the perceptions settle out, and then how would it be? The perceptions settle out, and the reactions don't disturb, and therefore the heart is brimming, lacking nothing. So it's a very beautiful image, right? Because it goes from feeling like this barren thing, absent of all kinds of, desire, to the heart that is brimming, that is not lacking in anything, right? There isn't this trying to fill a hole. Do you see? So this is a beautiful way of describing how it is. But then he goes on and he gives us a pointer about the practice, which will move in that direction, which will open this up for us, which could be our raft in the midst of the rough waters. And I want to make sure that we address this very directly. So again, I'm skipping a little bit. He says, like taking a mirror to look at your reflection. Don't get attached to the perceptions, which are like the image in the mirror. Like taking a mirror to look at your reflection. So this is the mind looking at the mind. This is right. And we talk about the mirror mind. That is the mind that can reflect clearly. Has to be pretty steady for that. No, it has to be free of the hindrances, at least temporarily, for that. And when you think about it in that perspective, you say, of course, if you look in the mirror and you see a reflected image there, you don't fall in love with what you see in the mirror. You don't have a fight with what you see in the mirror. You don't try to hold on to, grab a hold of that person that you see in the mirror. It wouldn't make any sense. So this kind of clear reflection can be a lovely metaphor for the practice of clear observation of the mind. And why, when that happens, then there are so many things which are just released, which, right? It's not the clinging isn't something that you force yourself to stop doing. It's just having seen that, then the clinging then stops making any sense. And then he gets even more specific with us, and he says, when the heart moves, or the mind moves, you can catch sight of the unadulterated heart. You know for sure that the movement is in yourself because it changes. So this is a very, very specific, detailed meditation instruction right there, right? When the mind moves, you catch sight of the unadulterated mind. What is the unadulterated mind, right? It is the mind that wasn't moving. So this points of movement, this is why the Buddha said very clearly that the perception of impermanence is one of the most powerful practices, more powerful than all sorts of giving, more powerful than taking refuge, more powerful than practicing the precepts even. The perception of impermanence. Not that you shouldn't do all those things, please don't Get me wrong. You do all of those things. And the perception of impermanence has this tremendous power for transformation because it is showing us exactly this mechanism that is at work. This mechanism that we have wrapped in a whole series of desires and wants and hopes and confusion. So when the mind moves, you can catch sight of the unadulterated mind. And you know for sure in that moment, when you see the mind moving, right? Then you know for sure that the movement is in yourself. You know that that mechanism is happening in here, that that's what's being perceived. Not something which is intrinsic to the thing out there. And for this reason, the Buddha very clearly describes consciousness when he talks about the khandhas, when he talks about mind and body in this particular framework, he mentions consciousness as a consciousness at each one of the sense gates, right? There's an ear consciousness, an eye consciousness. So meaning it's a particular particle that's flavored by the door that got impacted by some object. The mind also being a door, right? That gets impacted by mental objects. So this ability to see movement in the mind is actually a good thing. And let me just repeat that. The ability to see change in the mind is a good thing, right? So when you get frustrated that you're sitting there on your cushion and your mind goes to something else, that something else is also a movement of the mind. You may choose to put it back on some object where you were before, but that movement of the mind in and of itself is not bad. There's nothing wrong with it. It could just as well, right? This is part of Vipassana practice, is observing those, right? Movements of the mind with more and more and more precision. So please don't sit down and expect the mind to be in some steady state. Because even if that's what you seem to be perceiving, then I would say look closer. Even those sublime states, like the formless meditations, for example, where one is experiencing boundless consciousness, for example, that boundless consciousness is impermanent. It is also a changing state. It must be. It must be, because it is a perception, and therefore there's an element of all of those 5 khandhas in it. So this practice, so just to circle back all the way, so taking the Dhamma as our raft in the midst of rough waters, and this is what we typically perceive as the rough waters, right? Is these movements of the mind and the heart. And the dukkha that we feel when we have this grasping happening, this clinging to particular states of the mind and the heart that we're not ready to see as just that, just states. So when you feel that dukkha of holding on, that rope burn, that is the place to look. That is the place to stop and get really intimate with your own experience. Right there in his very first sermon, or at least as it's recorded in the Theravada tradition, in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the first turning of the wheel, the Buddha says, dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness or the suffering or the difficulty, inherent difficulty of life is to be understood. Look right there. And when you do that, then the Dhamma is your raft. The Dhamma is what keeps you from getting overwhelmed by those rough waters. Because it's helping you see the possibility of the mind that can be present with even that. Even dukkha. Or freedom, right? Or release. So I hope that you all have that opportunity, that you give yourselves that opportunity to have a look at the rough waters of your lives, steadied by the Dhamma, steadied by that heart that can look clearly and be what? Just to repeat Ajahn Mun's description, a heart thus brimming with nothing lacking. Thank you for your attention and your practice this evening.